Data is everywhere. Everything you say, everything you do, every action you take is data. But the truth is, for us business owners, how well do we use the data that we have? Today's guest is going to answer that question. So this is the Tech Your Business podcast where we break down technology to inform you about the latest in technology to help you learn more, earn more, do more in your business. My name is Peter, your host today, and our guest today is Collin Graves, who is the managing partner at Not Labs. So welcome to the show, Collin.
Peter, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So data, we're talking about data today, and it's a very interesting topic we've not talked about before. So before we go into that, just tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, so the audience can connect with you.
Sure. Yeah, Collin Graves. I'm the founder at North Labs. We help organizations develop data programs that deliver operational capabilities for their organizations. I've been in the cloud space for the last 17 years, so I'm definitely one of the old greyhounds at the track. I got started very early with AWS, actually, while I was in the military. I did not work on cloud in the military. I was turning wrenches and then flying with NATO Special Operations Forces in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. But I learned about AWS very early on and thought, I think this is going to be pretty big, and started a company while I was just getting out of the military that used the cloud to build software for construction firms to deliver large files over 2G cellular via the cloud. I exited from that business in 2014, and I started North Labs the sort of early in the morning, the day my 2-year non-compete expired. And originally, I wasn't going to go back down this cloud and data road. North Labs was going to be more of a startup or product incubator for the US market. I had brought several digital products to market, kind of thought I knew what I was doing, but not too far into starting the business, I just realized this cloud thing is bigger than it ever was. It is now widely accepted within organizations, and I think I want to be a part of that. So we just turned 8 years old. We've got a great team of people who work with our customers to help deliver value with data as quickly as possible and help them build data programs that are sustainable and really sort of try and combat the pretty nasty statistics that you see in the industry around data program failure rates and things like that. So yeah, happy to be here and talk to your listeners about what it takes to build a data program that's valuable.
What it takes to be. Okay, so you talked about being in the data space and then going back into the data space 2 years after, in fact, on the morning your non-compete expired. So what was missing? What did you leave behind that made you go back to that space? What was that gap?
It's a good question. You have to remember, when I ran my first group, I ran it between the years of 2010 and 2014, which doesn't seem like that long ago, but the cloud was not widely accepted at that time. We were still in a feeling out process. So I'm not joking when I say that I was chased out of more than one boardroom when I came in and I pitched the promise of the cloud and all of the flexibility and agility it could save for organizations. People weren't buying it back then. So selling the cloud was no easy feat. It really took the right person within an organization to see that vision. And so I ended up going back because I thought, okay, well, I had some success previously. Now, if the cloud is widely understood, or at least accepted, now I know that there are going to be real roadblocks that are happening to a lot more organizations. And I think I can help them, because at that point, I think I had built probably 100 or 150 data programs from scratch. Now we've built well over 1,000 from scratch, which not many people do, right? When you think about leaders within an organization today, they're likely inheriting data systems that are already sort of built out in some way. So it's a totally different process to build something from scratch, from nothing. And we find that a lot of organizations run into obstacles they didn't know existed when they get started going down that road. And so, yeah, the thesis was, I've done this a lot. I've seen where people fall down. I've seen where budgets get crazy. And I've seen where your intentions are really good, but you don't end up arriving at the destination you thought you would in terms of delivering value with that data. And so we've developed an entire sort of philosophy and methodology and obsession around how we help organizations arrive at that final destination.
So I think that really answers that question. And it's one thing a lot of us encounter. You were early to the market. You came into the market the first time at a time when cloud wasn't accepted. So you were early, you were years ahead, and you had to come back in at the right time. So you've mentioned this thing twice, building a data program. So for our audience who might be wondering, what does that mean? What's building a data program? How is that relevant to them?
Sure. So, like you said in your intro, data is everywhere. And it's widely understood that data is more important as an asset from a business standpoint than it's ever been before, right? And the sort of common lore today is if you're not working on improving your data-driven capabilities, whether that's insights, whether that's automation, whether that's applying AI or machine learning to your business, your competitors are. And we're doing so in an era where there's more data being produced than ever before. I'll give you an example. A large portion of my customers are in the manufacturing and industrial space. Lots of assets, taking raw materials through to finished goods and getting them to customers. And there's a lot of processes that have to occur within that value chain. The manufacturing industry produces 13 times more data than the US government. And the number of data producing systems in an average manufacturing facility has increased in the last 10 years from fewer than 50 systems to now more than 110 different systems. So all of those systems are producing this footprint, but they all are stored differently, live in different places, speak different languages. And now the opportunity is, how do we accelerate business growth, deliver more cost effectively, or give customers a better experience with our brand by unifying all of that data and creating a sort of cross-pollination effect within our business, where I can now relate data from system A to data with system Z and have a much more complete picture of how my business is operating. That's super important. And it's also not all that easy. A lot of people underestimate how easy that can be. Sure, I'll just slap on a business intelligence tool, a reporting tool into a database, and I'll arrive at, my utopia. There's a lot more than that goes on behind the scenes that most customers don't account for when they're just getting started on this journey. And that's really what we're all about.
It's an interesting insight, especially the part where it talks about the manufacturing industry producing 13 times more data than the US government. And I can see the importance when you talk about different systems producing different types of data and having to interconnect, having to have that data relate, communicate with each other to create a clearer picture. But when you look at it, how can having a system like this help a business? I think I can see a rough picture, but I think you can give us a clearer picture. How can having this kind of system, this data program you talked about, having everything talk together, how can it help a business succeed or do better?
Sure. It's a great question. So I'm going to talk about a concept that's been around since the 90s, I believe. It's called the theory of constraints. I don't know how familiar you are with that topic or how familiar your listeners are, but the theory of constraints came out of the industrial field, but it applies to anyone, whether you're a SaaS company, whether you're a healthcare company, it doesn't matter. The premise is this: at any point in time, a business consists of several or many different constraints, meaning this part of our value chain, whether it's delivering care to patients, whether it's pushing software releases for a SaaS company, or whether it's creating final goods for a manufacturing organization, it's not operating as effectively as it could be. And your business can only operate as quickly as that largest constraint allows it to operate. Okay.
Mhm.
So with our approach, we can go into customers and say, let's identify what these constraints are. Let's quantify what those constraints are doing to your business. And let's use data to remediate that. I'll give you an example. And this I'm going to give you a manufacturing example, but this can easily be applied to retail, to consumer goods. It doesn't matter. We had a customer come to us and say, 1 out of every 5 products that rolls off of our assembly line is sent to the scrap heap. It doesn't pass quality control. In some cases, it can go back and be reworked, but otherwise it's being sent basically to the dump, where we recycle the materials and try and reclaim a little bit of money. So 20%, that's pretty high. And we help the customer identify, okay, for every 1% reduction in that scrap, it's $1 million to the bottom line for the business every year. So they knew that scrap was occurring and that was a constraint, meaning even if we're operating perfectly everywhere else, only 80% of our finished goods are actually in a state to ship to customers. So if we think we can produce this many per hour, we're actually only yielding this many. And that's a problem because it means people have to work longer, machines need to run longer, machines break, people have to work overtime, customers are mad because they get a bad product, whatever the case may be. So we were able to use data across various systems to understand the state of that product at every step in the manufacturing process. And we were able to identify not something on the product, something on the machine that was causing the issue. And basically what it was is when the head of this tool heats up above 130 degrees Fahrenheit, everything it touches turns to scrap. So it's not 1 out of 5 across the assembly line. It's nothing, 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 and then 100% scrap from one assembly line. So we were able to use data to diagnose that issue. We were able to take it a step further to where we incorporated automation to say, okay, a normal operating temperature for this part is 110 degrees Fahrenheit. When it reaches 120 degrees Fahrenheit, slow that assembly line down by 25% because you'd rather have it running than not. And hopefully that allows it to cool off. If you reach 128 degrees, you're going to notify the plant supervisor that this is going on. And if it reaches 129.8 degrees Fahrenheit, trigger a full shutdown of the assembly line. Because now you're removing that constraint from the business. And that change by itself brought that 20% scrap rate down to 7%.
Wow.
So that was a $13 million a year net profit gain to that business. That is an annuity for the rest of time, right? That's a big example, but you can think through, right? When most people talk about data, they think dashboards, right? Dashboarding is one piece of the pie. And what building a data program consists of is how do I pour that foundation of the house, lay that perfect concrete where I can build any capability with my data that I want on top of that foundation. And That's my favorite example because it has such revenue or profit implications. But these constraints exist in any business. And the fact of the matter is constraints never go away. It's like that old arcade game, Whack-A-Mole, right? Or even if
Yeah.
you solve the big one, now there's another one that rears its head because the big constraint before was making the other constraint look smaller. But now that you have greater flow of your process, now that constraint gets big and maybe even bigger than the last one, but it allows you to sort of whack each of these moles, one at a time. And eventually you're going to see your business is able to perform much more efficiently.
Yeah, I think the whack-a-mole analogy is actually really perfect because that's basically what business is, solving one problem and another and another and another till either you quit or you die. It never ends.
And sometimes you don't know which is the better option.
And I actually like that example because, like you said, it can actually translate to anybody. Like, who would have ever thought, if you weren't looking at the data, you wouldn't have realized that that part of the machine getting to that 100-degree temperature was causing all that,
Right.
all those issues here. If you hadn't looked at the data, if you hadn't looked at everything. So a lot of companies try to do this thing you talk about. I know you talked about it earlier that it looks easy, but it's not as easy as it is. A lot of companies try to do this thing, create a data program to do things better, to do better with their data. A lot of them hire maybe a data officer from maybe an enterprise, a big company or whatever. And at the end of the day, you see that a lot of these data programs fail or never get off the ground. So from your experience over the past few years, why do you think this happens?
It's a great question. And you're exactly right. We see a lot of organizations. First of all, the statistic is pretty nasty. The statistic is from McKinsey. And the current understanding is that executives report that 87% of the time, their data programs have been officially deemed a failure.
Wow.
So that's not executives saying our data program is underperforming. That's executives saying it's failed. We haven't arrived where we thought we were. We thought we were going to sail across the Atlantic and somehow we find ourselves, over by Australia. We went totally the wrong direction. And there's three main reasons. First of all, your point about hiring an expensive data officer, I see this so many times, so often, right? You hire a bigwig from Silicon Valley or from a big major enterprise. Remember, this person probably didn't build anything from scratch. They inherited systems and probably made it better. Good for them. Don't take that credit away from them. But it's different when you're starting from scratch, right? And what's the first thing, Peter, that an expensive chief data officer is going to do in her first 90 days with your organization? She's going to come to you and say, Peter, I need $3 million in budget to hire a team, to acquire tools, and then we'll get started on building value for the business. But first, I've got to get the NBA All-Star team, right? I've got to get the Premier League hot shots all on one roster. Then we'll focus on how to actually win the match, right? This happens all the time. So there's three key areas, I think, where organizations fumble the ball, right? The first is data and lack of data. And by that, I don't mean you're not producing data. Businesses are producing data. I mean a lack of data integration. How do we get all of our data into one layer and get that data to speak the same language? That's a very difficult problem. Some of your data is very structured in a database. Some of your data is streaming in from different services. Some of your data are Word and PDF documents, but there's really good information in there. So how do we get that data to all speak the same language and subscribe to the same laws of physics? Okay. The second is the quality of that data. Huge issue in our world, right? You call it data management. We have data, The data is very poor quality. It's empty in some fields. It's duplicate, right? There are 2 Peters in the system or 20 Peters in the system, and I think it's the same person. And then the third is accessibility. If I know that the data is of decent quality and I know I can integrate it in, actually accessing those databases, those APIs to physically pull that information in is the third piece. The second main category is budget. And what I mean by that is underestimating how many personnel it takes to actually run a successful data program at scale. Because most executives think, okay, BI tool, database, and we're off and running. But what they're not factoring in is I have to create pipelines to ingest this data. I need to cleanse this data. I need to prepare, or what we call normalize the data, which is what gets that data speaking the same language I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I need to govern that data. I need to secure that data. I need to have compliance controls. I need to have an entire life cycle that goes on within this environment, or else I'm kind of stranded without a paddle. So in that case, the importance that I stress to everyone is starting small and getting small wins, as opposed to boiling the ocean. What's that one constraint we talked about? What is that doing to your business from a cost perspective? And what's the minimal amount of work you can do to begin showing value relative to that constraint? Don't build the whole house. Pour the foundation, right? The third is lack of domain understanding. So this goes back to the budget thing. Most people don't know everything involved with making data accessible and ready for analysis, let alone analyzing it. And the only thing worse than not having access to data is having access to bad data, right? Because if we have access to no data, it's business as usual. We continue to run our business how we have historically. If we have access to bad data, where now you think that, oh, I was wrong all along, right? I thought my customer was a 28-year-old female living in the UK. It's actually a 19-year-old male living in Oklahoma. So let me start marketing to that person. Now you're in a world of hurt, right? And then the last piece of that domain understanding is your value thesis. The overwhelming majority of companies don't go into building a data program with a sound value thesis in mind. And that goes back to that constraint I was talking about. Why do we care about this? Because having data infrastructure stood up in your organization without pointing it at anything related to the business is not valuable in the slightest. It just cost you money. So how do we actually begin to solve this constraint, this business problem that we agree is a thing and we have quantified and are willing to obsess over, right? How do we get as clear as possible and rally around that one thing? Because what happens most of the time is I'm the new chief data officer, this new hotshot, right? Or perhaps I'm just the CEO of an organization. And Peter is my trusted lieutenant from an IT or technology standpoint. And I say, Peter, go disappear into that supply closet for the next 6 months. And when you come out of there, I want this organization to be data-driven. And what's Peter going to do? He's not going to say, actually, boss, I think we should sit down and formulate a strategy. Peter's going to go, you got it, boss. I'm going to assemble some tools. I'm going to bring some data in. I'm going to build some dashboards that I think you'll find really fancy. And when you show it to me, I go, Peter, this doesn't solve my problems at all. What have you been doing the last 6 months? Right now my trust in you is impacted. Right. And I would be willing to argue that 9 out of 10 organizations go into building a data program without a value thesis, or what we at North Labs call the North Star. Why are we here? Why is this important? And what will it do for the business quantifiably? right? Real numbers. So then you can measure against that. And those small wins, like I talked about before, you can begin to see that positive traction that's going on in the business, right?
Yeah.
All of those three things together are hugely important. And typically, one or many of those are missing within an organization as they get started.
It's an interesting one. So lack of data integration, the quality of the data, the lack of domain understanding, those are some things that really lead to the failure of the 87% failure, like you said, of these
Right.
data programs. Okay, so earlier in the interview, you talked about strengthening your data core as a business. So what does this mean for a business owner, strengthening your data core?
Yeah, it's going to go back to what I was just talking about. But when I say strengthen your data core, really it's this understanding of how you approach solving a problem with data, right? Everybody understands that they're producing data. And most of the time, if you're in a position where you say, let's use data to help address this problem, you know that you're collecting data around that problem statement, perhaps across several different systems. So the idea of strengthening your data core is formulating that North Star. What do I actually want to do with this data first? Most executives can tell me, listen, I see the dominoes lined up and I know the last domino. I know what I want that last domino to be when it falls. That's my utopia. We're data-driven, we're efficient, we're saving money, we're operating quickly. But what's that first domino I need to flick over to start that chain reaction, right? And that is all about that constraint I talked about, so that North Star. And then it's about identifying the minimum viable technology footprint required to solve that problem. Most organizations that look like North Labs in the space will be more than ready to build you an F1 car. Hey, we want to be data-driven. Great. I happen to know the lead engineer at McLaren. They've got a heck of a race car. I'm going to build you one of those. When in fact, most organizations who are just starting out, they need a scooter. They need a Corolla. They need something that will begin the process. Because if I build you an F1 car, Peter, and I hand you the figurative keys to it and say, best of luck, try not to crash in Spa at the high-speed corners, and give me a call if you do, you're going to be so deflated when you take that car out and you crash it in the first corner that you're going to abandon your pursuits. And so the answer to this, in some circumstances, might be a tiny subset of the overall technology that you might need in the future. Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not everything all at once. So if I'll use an analogy for your audience that I think helps. Think of a layer cake. Say I'm a chef and I create layer cakes for people. So layer upon layer, delicious. The typical way that organizations think about building a data program is putting one complete layer at a time. They build it like a layer cake, one full layer, then the next full layer. What I advocate for is, what if we could change that up to where you're building one entire slice of the layer cake at a time? And we'll assemble different slices over time. And pretty soon we have the full cake. We just went a slightly different direction. We started smaller, but you still had all of the layers, right? It wasn't about that first core layer that doesn't really provide value. And then the second and third and fourth layer that, yeah, it just costs a lot of time and it's really expensive. And then we get to the fifth, sixth, and seventh, and we go, okay, yeah, maybe we're getting somewhere. If you can make one slice of the layer cake at a time, now all of a sudden you're in a position to unlock value much more quickly. And as long as you're making reasonable tooling decisions, there are so many good tools out there. You're going to be in a position where you can design the rest of that cake over time.
I think that really focuses on what you talked about earlier about the importance of starting small and not just trying to get the end result the first time.
Right. Because otherwise, remember our chief data officer, Peter, who we hired?
Yeah.
Right. That he's coming to me and saying, listen, I need this budget to begin delivering on this. He might only get that first layer poured in the first year, maybe. So then he's coming back to the CEO and saying, I actually need that budget plus 10% for next year. And maybe I'll get that second layer of the layer cake made. But you're nowhere near in a position to actually realize business value with those first two layers. That's just, let's ingest the data somewhere and maybe we kind of understand what the data looks like, but it's not clean yet. It's not normalized. It's not ready to ask questions of. It's not ready to create automations for. It's just sort of there. Well, now as an executive, what do I think? We're not pointed at a value thesis. There is no ROI here. Right? Now you're essentially building me a cost center where I'm spending money, but it doesn't drive value. Data is a profit center. Data, if effectively used, drives revenue, drives profit retention. It's not like running servers, right? IT is historically a cost center. It's a necessary evil. I just need to run this data center, or I need to have this cloud bill because it supports my business, but it doesn't generate profit. Data does. But if I take the traditional approach, that layer by layer approach, I'm years away from ever producing revenue, let alone profit. And what am I going to do? Year 4 or 5, I'm going to go, Peter, enough is enough, man. I'm not renewing this budget, and it's time for you to move on. I've got nothing to show for this. And this is what happens all the time.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so earlier you talked about your military background as an aircraft mechanic, yeah, and your NATO experience in different continents and countries. So how has your military background influenced your approach in business, in running North Labs, and generally?
That's a great question. I think there are two key pieces. The first is the best leaders I ever met in the military in some of the most elite forces you can ask for. So whether that's Navy SEALs, Delta Force, MARSOC, Green Beret, Army Rangers, or it's even SAS from the UK forces. These people are calm, they're gentle, but they have fangs that can come out when they need to. And I see a lot of business owners I meet who really like to dictate, right? And they speak loudly and they speak aggressively and just get this done. And I've learned that the best leaders show empathy, show care, show kindness, but they do have a reserve system where if they need to let the fangs out a little bit, not for internal people, but usually to protect their internal people from nasty customers, for example.
Yeah.
They're more than willing to do that. And the second piece is delegation. I still have a problem with this today, and I work on it every single day. But the reason why, especially the US military, for how big it is, right? If the Department of Defense was a country, it would be like the 25th largest country in the world.
Wow.
In terms of its budget. That's insane. The reason why the military can move so quickly is because they've adopted principles of extreme delegation. And I think this is an important one. Most business owners love to keep their hand in everything, myself included. So I'm talking to myself here. They love to be involved, not because they don't trust their people, but because it's their baby. It's a part of their fabric. It's who they are, right? Business owners, our business is our identity most of the time. And so you want to be involved, even if you trust your people completely. Learning how to delegate as far down the org chart as possible is so critical for running a profitable, scale-ready business. You are not needed for most things in your business. If you're hiring great people and you have a great culture of camaraderie and accountability, I would argue you're needed in very little. Perhaps the only thing you're needed for is to go on podcasts and talk about how to build data programs, right? But the people you hired can handle it. And most people just sort of delegate down one level to their trusted lieutenants. I'll delegate down to my VP. And my argument is learn how to delegate down even further, because if you're hiring really good individual contributors, those people don't want to be put in a box where, hey, this is all I do for my job. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. We insist on hiring the best and brightest, and then we say, this is your job, and if you step outside of this bounds, we're going to have an issue. So letting them run with it and then coaching them on, well, here's how I would have done it. Letting sales, if you're a founder who still runs sales and you bring on your first salesperson, the natural tendency is to continue to run sales and use that salesperson almost as like an assistant of sorts. Again, speaking to myself, because we're transitioning out of founder-led sales land. And the best thing I've learned is you're hiring these brilliant people with big brains and really good insight into what you do. Let them run and let them fall down. Because if they fall down and you help them back up and go, it's okay, I'd have done it this way, right? And we're going to commit to doing this next time. Guess what? They'll do it next time. And they'll be that much more proficient, and they're going to stick around longer because they're doing something that makes them feel like they're growing in their career. So those are the big things, right? The generals aren't on the field with, operating the campaigns. They're not running the missions. And the Navy SEALs, for example, it's not just the SEAL commander kicking in the door. Yeah. It's the young buck who's just learning how to be a SEAL who's kicking in the door. But guess what? He's got a whole team of people around him who he can trust with his life and who he knows will help him continue to grow. And I see a lot of organizations who are trying to scale and mature get stuck in that scenario.
That's a lot of wisdom, actually. And I think a lot of business owners will relate to this, to what you said about wanting to be in everything included.
Always. Yeah. And that's okay. Right. But it's a challenge you should take upon yourself to say, look, and if you truly don't feel like you can trust your team to get it done, you have the wrong team. But true. Most of the time you've hired the right team and you just don't trust yourself to relinquish control over the team. But guess what? It's a lot easier to fix yourself than it is to fix others. True. And so I always sort of gut check myself, and I'm not perfect at it by any stretch of the imagination, but we at least have a culture of accountability at North Labs where people can say, I'm supposed to handle that, not you. That's my job. And you tell me where I screw up and you tell me where I succeeded, but that's on me to do. And that's a really, really cool culture to have.
Interesting. All right. So looking ahead, looking into the next few years, how do you see data? Because you said data, a lot more data is being created now than ever before. So how do you see this data changing the landscape for businesses in the next few years?
Two distinct avenues. The first is more real-time data. So most of the time organizations today will update their data in their system, say every few hours, nightly, whatever. We will move toward faster cadence where I have more of a real-time view of what's going on in my business. That takes additional time and budget to implement, but it'll become more affordable, more of a commodity. The second, to no one's surprise, is AI. Gen AI is the single biggest wave of innovation I have seen since the advent of the cloud in 2006. There has never been anything that I've seen like Gen AI. Now, here's the thing. There's two issues with that. One is the amount of noise that's going to be created in the ecosystem, because everyone and their auntie in the business world right now says that they are AI driven or they have AI functionality.
Yeah.
Because they're scratching the backs of their investors who are saying you have to incorporate Gen AI into your product. So what we're going to see is organizations like my customers saying, "Oh yeah, we use AI. We use data effectively because we use the little chatbot tools on all 100 of our products." Well, that doesn't actually create capabilities. That might cut down a task or two, but you're not there's no value thesis attached to that whatsoever. And then secondly is just most people think, right? I've been talking about this layer cake, this sound data infrastructure. A lot of people think I can skip past those chapters of the book and jump straight to the chapter on Gen AI. And if I incorporate Gen AI, then I don't need the data system. That is so wrong, because the Gen AI, that the large language models that run Gen AI systems have to establish context in order to operate correctly. I need to know as a large language model what the heck Peter is talking about when he asks me a question. So if you don't have that foundation of the house, that first layer of the layer cake built out, your Gen AI adoption is going to run into a wall. Because I can get on Chat GPT today and I can have a full conversation with it and make it pretend like it speaks in the voice of Sean Connery. But as it relates to my business, I need to be able to point that model somewhere to develop contextual understanding of my business. Where do you point that? You point it to that unified layer of data. Remember, same laws of physics, it all speaks the same language. Guess what the benefit of that is? Now that LLM understands what your data means. And now you're able to use Gen AI to create massive value for your organization. But that will never happen unless you start with pouring that foundation like we talked about earlier. It can't happen.
Very interesting. So what's one piece of advice for any business owner who has maybe listened to this and wants to start taking their data more seriously? What's one piece of advice you would give to them about starting their data journey? I know you've shared a lot of things, but what's the biggest thing you're going to tell them?
I love that question. And it's going to be counter to what most people are thinking of. So if you're listening to this and you think the answer is figure out what tools will solve your problem, you are wrong. The best thing you can do is to look at your business, the thing that you understand better than anyone, and understand where your largest constraint is. What's the area of your business that slows down your efficiency the most? Whether that's delivering services to your customer, whether it's your, understanding who you're marketing to on social media, or how, or maybe it goes back to that scrap issue from before, where, a lot of our products aren't quite making it through the assembly line without running into problems. Figure out what that constraint is, and then obsess over how much money that costs you every year to mitigate. How much money are you wasting? How much money are you spending on process to try and circumvent that issue today? That's your North Star. What hurts the most? How much does it cost your business, either in real dollars or time cost or product cost or whatever? And what would improving that constraint by 10% do to your P&L, by 20%, by 30%. Until you can understand that North Star completely, you're not ready to build a data program. And everything else in the market, all the headlines, all of the marketing emails you get are just noise. It's just a distraction. So that would be the first thing. It's the first thing we do with all of our customers who come to us and say, we want the shiniest tool, the shiniest car with the, sparkliest rims. It doesn't matter, because most of these problems can be solved with just about any good tool on the market.
Yeah.
But you need to understand what you're trying to solve first.
All right. So I think for anyone listening, you've heard it. It's not the tools that are going to solve your problems. Find your North Star or your largest constraints and obsess over how much it's losing you every year. That's the advice from Collin today. So for listeners who have stayed with us this far, they're interested in what you do, they want to learn more from you, they want to connect from you, maybe they want to work with you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Sure. I don't have social media other than LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn at /Collin with 2 L's, Graves, like dead people. Otherwise, if you're in a position where you say, hey, I know I have constraints, I think data can help solve these problems, you can go to buildmydatablueprint.com, and that will link you to a 4-week engagement we do with all new customers. And it's really, we talked about building the house earlier. It's all about drafting the blueprint of what your systems and architecture will look like and how that relates to your North Star. And if you're having trouble formulating your North Star, guess what? We help you formulate your North Star and quantify your North Star. So feel free to reach out there, but LinkedIn is great. I'm open to connect with anyone, always available for questions. And I definitely appreciate the opportunity to connect with your listeners.
All right, so you've heard him on LinkedIn, Collin with 2 L's and Graves, like dead people. And you go to the website, buildmydatablueprint.com. So those two will be in the show notes and they'll be on the screen once this episode, in fact, as far as you're listening to this. So thank you so much, Collin, for coming on the show today.
Absolutely, Peter. It was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So for the listeners, did you get any value from this episode? If you did, please share with anyone who you know it would help, anyone who wants to get started with their data, anyone who has the constraint, who has a constraint, who has something. You heard about the temperature leading to a lot of things ending up in the scrap heap. Anyone who has that kind of problem, share it with them. And if you want to be the first person to know when we post helpful content like this, don't forget to like, subscribe wherever you're seeing us or hearing us on. So we have almost 100 episodes and we release an episode every week. So till next week, when we come with a brand new episode, scroll through, listen to as many of the 100 as would help your business. And don't forget to keep taking your business. Bye for now.